Well, it looks like we have a few people in, so I'll just get started with introductions. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are running this webinar through the Institute for the Environment. My name is Katie Hughey, and I'm here with, or do you want to introduce yourself, Ben?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Ben Rappaport, and we have a great panel of people here to talk about planning and equity and transportation and all the challenges that 2020 has thrown into that mix. So yeah, I'm really excited, and I hope you guys have some good questions and are ready for a great conversation. And also, just to reiterate what Brian said in the chat, this is a Zoom webinar, so at the bottom, instead of the normal like chat function, you'll see the Q&A like speech bubble thing. So please type your questions in there, and I'll be kind of behind the scenes moderating them while the conversation is going on. So.
Yeah, and we're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the hour to let people address, or let our panelists address the questions. So we're here with the Institute for the Environment. Ben and I are both juniors in the ENAC department, and so we just wanted to have this webinar today to talk about transportation and mobility amongst everything that's been going on this summer with COVID, and just talk about like a key factor that we should all be taking into account as planners, which is equity. So before we get started, I just want to thank Greg Ganji, Kirsten Williams, Brian Ness, and Lexi Parvin for helping me get all of this together and plan everything. And I would love to thank the panelists for joining us today as well and taking the time out of their day to provide some insight on what they've been doing. So I guess to start off with, everyone can just go around and introduce yourselves. If you could just talk about what you do, how long you've been in your position, and maybe like if there are any exciting projects that you're working on or just something that's happening in your department, and your favorite mode of transportation. So would you like to start, Anne? And then we will move to Jeffrey, and then Adie and Bergen.
Sounds great. So I'm Anne Phillips. I'm a planner with the DCHC-MPO, and DCHC stands for Durham, Chapel Hill, Carborough Metropolitan Planning Organization. And we plan for the region, so basically Durham County and parts of Orange and Chatham counties. And I've been in my position for less than 5 months, I believe. Currently, I'm working on the update of the Durham Transit Plan and the Metropolitan Transportation Plan update, which is a 25-year plan that is federally required for a region. My favorite mode, I think people don't usually think of it this way, but I like walking. I think there's something wonderful about being in a city and just being able to walk around and get where you need to go.
Hey everybody, I am Jeffrey Sullivan. I don't need to lean that close to the camera. I'm the community outreach manager with Chapel Hill Transit, which is the department of the town of Chapel Hill. Essentially, my job is to communicate anything that's going on with the transit system in Chapel Hill, do community outreach, work with our internal employees to make sure that there's a general sense of cohesion, and make sure that anything that you all or the residents of Chapel Hill, the students at the university have to say about the transit system gets routed to the right place. I've been in this position for almost a year. Before that, I spent 5 years at the Go Triangle, 2 of them working with Anne on marketing the Go Durham system, making sure that people knew what the transit system was about in Durham, and another 2.5 working on the light rail project that was part of the Durham and Orange County transit plans. My favorite mode, and really Anne took it, so I'm gonna switch to my second favorite and go with trains probably. Like a good train, I'm a very tall person, and so having legroom and the ability to walk and stretch on a long trip is fantastic.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Hey, everyone. My name is Adie Tomer. I work for the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program in Washington, D.C. Although the wood paneling you see behind me is authentic, I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, and this is the kind of rooms they build around here. But I grew up in Florida, so it's I've been living all over the place. The Brookings Institution is the oldest policy research organization in the world, including in the country. Just had our 100-year anniversary. And the Metropolitan Policy Program is coming up on our 25th anniversary. We are the people who focus on urban, suburban, and rural issues, mostly focused on economics, but that includes, right, social issues and, of course, the environment. I lead our infrastructure team, so in particular focusing on transportation and land use, which I'm really excited to talk to you all about today. But we also do work on water issues and broadband as well. I've been in my role for 13 years and pretty much have done almost my entire career at Brookings, which is really kind of special to get a chance to see it from that perspective, from kind of moving from very entry level to something else now. My favorite mode of transportation is bicycling. We've lived in pretty dense, my wife and I and our kids have been living in pretty dense places for a long time. And there's nothing for me much better than moving much faster than cars and buses all around you and getting that wind in your face. So I'll pick that one.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bergen Watterson. I am the Transportation Planning Manager for the town of Chapel Hill. I've been in this position for about 3.5 years. Prior to that, I was the Transportation Planner for the town of Carrboro for a little over 2 years. I live in Carrboro, so it's really fun to work. I mean, Chapel Hill and Carrboro, anyone who lives here they're adjacent, they're kind of the same community. So it's really fun to do this work for my own community and be, aware of and familiar with the roads and the streets and their needs. So some of I guess the biggest thing I've been working on since COVID happened is, if anyone's been out on Franklin Street lately, we have repurposed 2 of the vehicular travel lanes and turned them into temporary walkways, multi-use paths, etc. Which is not only to allow more space for people walking, riding, running, and allow them to maintain their social distance, but also to free up the sidewalk more to support our local businesses and let them put out more dining, put their retail out on the sidewalk, do whatever they want out there as long as they have a permit. So that's taken up a lot of my COVID time, and it's now fully implemented, and we'll be doing some assessment of that. And I can talk about some of the challenges and whatnot that we've had with that project. My favorite, I'm sorry to copy, but my favorite, there's nothing else. It's the bike. I spent about 7 years racing bikes semi-professionally and just love it. Ride around town as much as I can. We've got one of the bikes that our 3 kids can sit on the back. They've all riding bikes as basically as early as they can walk. So that's, sorry to copy, but I couldn't say anything else.
So with that, I'm just stopping the screen share so you can see all of our panelists' beautiful faces, and we can just get started with the question. So the first question is, how have travel patterns changed as a result of COVID, and how do you think that they'll continue to change?
I can take a first stab at it, Katie. So this has been really the question everyone across the country has been asking themselves. I was really fortunate, and really honestly, I think the reason I'm on this panel, right, which I'm excited about, is Greg and his team invited me down through some kind of common network folks to the conference that was down. And I apologize, Greg, if I messed up the dates. Katie and Ben, you might remember it. Actually, the folks who are local will too. The faux snow day back at last March. And I'm probably giving Greg the shakes right now, thinking about how the conference had to be shut down. I mean, the whole city, it was nuts. And it felt like that was the last trip I took. And I honestly, I just have to travel out for my job, which isn't great, frankly. And And I didn't think anything of it, and it was just kind of surreal how much the world has changed since then. In particular, what we've seen is a precipitous drop in all travel habits, with one major exception of Bergen and I's favorite mode, basically, over the last few months. We have pretty good historic data at the national level and in states and many metropolitan areas and cities on, in particular, driving habits, transit trips, and airline passengers, and all of them experience effectively the largest drop in recorded history, which is really saying basically like a little bit less than the last century. And it immediately raised a whole bunch of alarm bells because not only were we uncertain from an environmental perspective if these benefits of having less people on the road would be sustained, but it was such a clear indication of the economic calamity that has now hit the country. February 18th, thank you down there, Greg. So so no one would ask to deliver these kind of environmental benefits by basically untethering people from their jobs, disconnecting social networks. I mean, it's just unfathomable. But then it immediately raises questions, right? And I'm sure the folks right in the triangle area were asking themselves, right? Like, how long is this going to last? And in particular, so much of our revenue system, whether it's for transit to road networks, and of course to the airlines themselves who are private, they rely on usage to create the tax revenues that get reinvested in the system. So as much as there were some environmental benefits and of course devastating economic consequences that were where the transportation habits were the signal, this was not a good outcome for local and state governments across the country, to say nothing of the Federal Highway Trust Fund. What we've seen is a unique set of changes since then. Nationally, right, and I'm sure we'll hear from Jeffrey and others, right, about what's happening with transit in the region, but a really tough environment for transit nationally to come back. And of course, the science is kind of mixed on this in the sense that it seems to be pointing to that there's no reason to have any health scares on transit. But it's such early days, so that's why I shouldn't say mixed, I think it's just early. But the mixed part is people's fears are real, right? And that's hard to just manage, right? To call it for what it is. And people are scared to go into shared enclosed spaces right now. That's a tough environment for transit. That has nothing to do with the essential and important role that transit plays in every community. On top of it, people aren't returning to work. Yet people have also taken up recreation as they need to get out of their house, especially advanced service workers. So we have this fascinating uptick in biking. It is impossible to find a bike in some markets, which is a great thing for the bike industry, not great for everyone who wants a bike. We've seen pedestrian walking, especially intra-neighborhood, so basically like walking in circles. We've seen it from Google Mobility Trends and Apple Trends data. That's not only went up right away, it's kind of sustained itself. But most troubling, as we've seen more people go back to work, combined with this fear of transit, is that driving levels are not just coming back, but we're seeing solo driving rates actually ticking up. And that gets to the core challenge that we face as a country in the long term anyways, where, knock on wood, right, we develop a vaccine and can return to some normalcy here, is that Americans' driving habits, I'm speaking really candidly here, right, they are our number one emitter of greenhouse gases now. It is clearly our area that we need the most reform because our energy generation systems are getting cleaner, maybe not as fast as we all like, but they're actually improving. Our transportation emissions are actually going up. So we have got to figure out how to both get people out of cars, but if they're going to keep driving, we need to get them in extremely clean cars, ideally EVs. And I think to wrap it all up, what this moment has shown is that Americans are deeply, deeply tied to their vehicles, and land use patterns will not change quickly. So to travel these far distances, people are going to keep driving, and we have got to figure out a way to manage that and use this opportunity to learn for the future, especially from an environmental perspective, how we can deliver a more sustainable environment going forward.
I think as a transit provider, we saw a lot of people who, in our community, the university let people go home early. A lot of people working from home. So you expect your rates to go down, but as we began to open back up, we just started to begin to see the weight that uncertainty plays on people's driving habits. You know, a lot of people in our community, especially, were trying to figure out where they were going to live. A lot of people were trying to figure out, do they have to go to work? Like, are classes going to be online or are they not? A lot of people still don't really know a lot about how it spreads or like what we are going to be able to do or how many people are going to want to be using transit or, you know, what the university wants to do in terms of parking regulations. So I think another piece of what we're seeing is a lot of people avoiding using transit and other services just because they don't know what to expect, what it's going to look like. Are they going to be waiting at a bus stop with 50 other people and not be able to catch a bus for 20 minutes, an hour or something like that? Or are they going to be the only person on the bus? What are they going to be the only person on the bus wearing a mask, or will everybody else, you know, be wearing protective gear so that it's a safe space? That's, you know, that's something that's just hard with transit because it's a general free public thing. And everybody has to make their own decision, which I think is going to be another tough thing, just battling this uncertainty that we are currently experiencing and that we're probably going to be experiencing even once the pandemic is over, and we are determining what new normal looks like.
A couple other things I wanted to note is so I think the transit patterns looked a little different in Durham. A lot of systems around the country, they saw drastic decline in people using transit. We didn't see that in Durham because of our Go Durham ridership. Many of the people who ride Go Durham are transit dependent. So while people were like at 40–50% in Durham, I think we were at like 80%. And then we had drivers calling out because they were also scared. And so essentially we had to shift to weekend service for a lot of quarantine, and we still had people, you know, needing to travel and transit being their only option. The other thing too of I used to work in like the transportation safety space. And so I was talking to one of our traffic engineers in Durham the other day. And she mentioned that, like, you know, because the thing I was thinking, people are not driving as much, as Adie pointed out. And so I was like, oh, this must be great news for crashes. Crashes must be down. And she mentioned that on average, we have about 1,200 crashes a month in Durham or something like that. I think that's what she said. It's been down through most of quarantine around 600, and it's climbing back up. But the severity of crashes has increased because of the level of speeding. And so we're seeing that nationally, even though there are fewer cars on the road, people are speeding. So it's kind of, it's not a great combination. So I just wanted to highlight those two things.
I was just going to piggyback off of something Anne said. I think that it's important to look at I think one of the interesting things to note are the differences between who is writing. You know, at the university, a lot of our stuff is driven by a lot of our demand is driven by singular employers, the university, the health system, which, you know, were able to, without as much demand for parking on campus, they were able to open up some of their decks, allow more people to park, which took away a lot of the demand for transit, and a lot of their people were able to shift to working from home or doing something else. Whereas I think, not to say there's not a lot of that in Durham, but a lot of the ridership we saw in Chapel Hill, in Durham, in Raleigh, were the people who did not have that ability, who couldn't shift to something else, who had to be at their place, and who had to be at their place of employment, and you know, through that. So you know, that brings up the question of like of equity when it comes to who needs transit and what can we provide in the middle of a crisis, and what do we still need going forward.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. And I guess to tag on to what Anne said about the higher speeds that we're seeing, I remember like an article coming out several months ago where someone was talking about how quickly they made it from one side of the country to the other. And it was sort of like a big celebration, which was interesting because you do have to wonder like how that has affected people's overall safety while they're on the road. So yeah, I guess like going into, that does bring us into like the next question with safety and accessibility. Like, how are your departments or you know, different projects that you're working on, how are you working to address problems of safety or accessibility, or you know, being able to you know, get to the hospital if people, you know, are having trouble breathing or things like that? How are you working to sort of manage all of that at once?
So I can kind of speak from I guess like a micro level, just talking about like what we do as a transit agency. So first thing first was coordination. We wanted to make sure we knew who was doing what. We wanted to make sure that we were plugged into our emergency services and our health department so that we were getting the latest information to make our calls on. So many meetings set up just to talk around safety parameters, what we know about the virus, what we know about our people, who's going to be where, so that we can make decisions about service levels. We have the challenge of having multiple groups that we have to think about. Like we have to think about our operators who are on a bus interacting with people every day. In March, it was 6 days a week. Now it's 7 days a week for over a span of 8 to 12 hours. So we have to make sure that they are safe first, A, because every employee deserves to come to a safe workspace, but B, also because we are providing an essential service. And if enough of our operators come out, we can no longer provide that service, which has cascading effects for the rest of the community. And then we also have to think about our passengers, because what good is transit if it becomes a sickness trap? The first thing we focused on was getting a lot of protective equipment, for our operators, hand sanitizer, gloves, face shields, masks, making sure we had enough of that. And then once we got enough to make sure that our people were taken care of, getting even more so that we could provide some to people who didn't have any on our buses. We have been doing research, reading article after article about what bigger systems are doing in terms of cleaning. So we've experimented with foggers that, you know, spray cleaning equipment throughout the bus that coats the surfaces so that we can make sure we get the virus out the air, testing UV lights, all kinds of things to make sure that we're providing a clean vehicle and that we're doing it as efficiently and fast as possible so that we can put as many buses out on the road. Typically before this, we would clean the vehicles maybe once a week, or we would spot clean if there was a specific issue. That quickly became daily, and that quickly became, we need to do it multiple times a day. And it, you know, it's just hard to, I said, you know, you may not know, but it's hard to get a bus on the road back to the garage to go through a cleaning regimen to get it back on the road. So the faster we were able to get that process done, the easier it was to put more service on the road. Our maintenance crew were real mavericks, or I don't know if mavericks is the right word, but like they were ingenious in figuring out how to make shields for operators, how to install stuff so that we could have hand sanitizer available on buses, so that we could have masks available on buses. Our maintenance crew essentially retrofitted our entire fleet of about 120 vehicles to have just various modifications to make our buses safer. And, you know, we're still working on what we can do, the signage that we need to add, all those kinds of things, so that we are providing a safe vehicle and we can, you know, communicate what's being done to keep people safe while they're riding with us.
I think from a bike ped perspective in Chapel Hill, you know, at the very beginning of COVID, all of these articles started coming out about COVID streets, you know, use this opportunity to do open streets all around town and, you know, build these temporary facilities for bikes and pedestrians. And, we jumped on that and we started to think about it. I think the first priority was Franklin Street, because that was sort of a double whammy, that we could create more space and accessibility and safer conditions for pedestrians, but also support the local businesses. But as soon as that really got towards implementation, we bought a bunch of, like tactical urbanism type materials, the wooden dowels, the duct tape, cones, things like that, with the thought that we would do some of these improvements on our local streets, because we have full jurisdiction over those, whereas a lot of our bigger, unsafer roads are DOT roads, which I will talk about in a second. So we put out a survey to the public asking, where do you feel cramped? Where would you want to have more bike and pedestrian space? With hopes of getting some ideas for roads where we could install these temporary walkways along the side. And we got close to 100 responses, and we're still kind of sorting through those and figuring out which ones we can do and which ones we can implement. But at the same time, as I kind of just mentioned, many of our local roads are not the ones that provide accessibility to things like hospitals or schools or things like that. Those are the big, nasty NCDOT roads that we are not. I mean, the Franklin Street installation took us about 3 months to hire an engineer to do pavement marking plans, to find the several $100,000 to buy all of the materials that DOT required us to install. So obviously that wasn't something that we can do on more than Franklin Street. So while we are able to kind of, help people feel safer and supply more area to do the social distancing, the accessibility, we're not really meeting that that need, unfortunately, at least through the bike and ped world.
Great. And oh, sorry. Do you want
to? Oh, no, I just wanted to say, like, in Durham, I think we wanted to, our transportation director was very cautious about the COVID streets concept, just because of, the issues with transit and the demand we were facing there and the problems that we were trying to solve. And I think there was a lot of debate nationally about COVID streets or safer streets, and whether you could equitably engage people, given that, in-person engagement was no longer an option the way that we're used to it. So in creating these streets, which were essentially an amenity for people who could work from home, and, how could we do it in a way that, it was a difficult balancing act, I'll put it that way. So I think this brings up a lot of the questions of equity that we probably want to touch on a little later. So I just wanted to flag that.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's something that we really struggled with also, that we are very limited in our outreach opportunities now. It is essentially all online. And we did, when we got our list of suggestions and looked around, kind of mapped them around town and saw where they are, it's not very equitably distributed. So we were kind of thinking, well, maybe we should just go in and block off this road. But then, of course, you can't just do that if nobody asks for it. And how can we get into these populations and into these neighborhoods and really find out what would be useful and helpful? And we haven't quite gotten there yet, because we're not going to go knocking on doors or setting up a table right now. So if anyone has ideas, please share.
I think this, and sorry, I keep saying we, I used to work for the city of Durham, so it's hard because I'm also the DCHC is housed in the transportation department. So I'm just going to take credit for all of it. So I think what the city of Durham did was door hangers. So they partnered with a bike advocacy group like Durham, and they hung door hangers in some of those neighborhoods that we thought would be harder to reach with just online engagement. So.
Great. Well, yeah, that definitely brings us into our next question, which was about community engagement. And so I think it's cool that you guys found that very creative way, I guess, to engage with the community and, people in their respective neighborhoods while staying socially distanced. Are there other ways that y'all are looking to sort of increase the level of community engagement as we think about, just new ways that we have to position ourselves when we're planning for the new transportation patterns that we're seeing and the new I guess, concerns that are arising, whether it's healthcare access or, just being able to get to work at a more limited capacity. Are there new methods that you are thinking about?
I'm sorry, can you ask that one more time?
Yeah, I was just curious about if there are other methods that you're implementing or planning to implement as far as community engagement goes, and just continuing to better understand the needs of different people who are just facing different challenges during COVID and dealing with the social distancing.
Yeah, I would say this has been, oh, sorry, Jeffrey, were you trying to?
No.
I think the silence is indicative of like how much we're struggling with this. So in the city and at the MPO, we've started measuring our engagement, like the demographics of our engagement, about a couple of years ago. And so I think this really let us see like how skewed our engagement was. And so we were doing lots of different things in the last couple of years, like intercept surveying and things like that to reach communities that we don't normally reach. And I think we were in a great streak, and then COVID happened, and it just kind of took this option of like in-person engagement away. And we still have all of these plans, many of which are like federally required, and we can't stop them, right? So it's like, and we're hearing from our elected officials, since they now expect the transparency of like the demographic information for engagement, like how are you going to engage people? So it'd be interesting to hear from Adie or anyone who like has solutions to this, because I can't tell you the number of webinars that I've watched, and like I don't feel like this is a problem that people have really solved. So we're really looking to what folks are doing around the country and hoping to borrow some solutions.
Yeah, I thought urban planners had community engagement solved before this. So it's like this was such a hard thing before, right? Like deep in planning circles, and I know, right, like the three of you know this, but like saying it to some of the attendees who may not, and to be clear, I learned from peers on this. This isn't me actually even speaking from direct experience. It has been so tough, right, in just the entire modern generation of urban planners, which we're really only like, we're not really that deep into. I mean, there really weren't planned communities for most of America, most of kind of like human civilization's history. This is really a pretty recent phenomenon. We cannot crack the code, right, on figuring out how to directly engage with all community members. And in particular, there's this pernicious problem in the United States. I don't know why I'm laughing, but maybe because it's like a university setting where those who are older and are not employed are most able to come to community meetings and voice their opinions. And that's great that they're being heard. That them being heard is not the problem. The problem is who's not being heard and how this starts to mix up into the decision-making apparatus. You just spoke really well, all three of you, right, about the inability to reach folks and how that is physically unsafe. We do some work on the digital divide. It is very real. It puts the communities we're most sensitive to wanting to reach anyway, meaning from this past problems, now they're even harder to find, right? And more than likely and tragically, probably experiencing both a mix of the biggest impacts from the public health crisis and the recession. So, I mean, this is just a toxic, troubling, heartbreaking mix. Then on top of it, what I've seen nationally, which I'd love y'all's reflections on too, to be clear, is the Oakland, California, their community got a lot of really great press, right? They were kind of the first one to get really good coverage on their slow streets and closed streets movement, which is similar to what Bergen explained. I'm not sure, I know where Franklin Street is, but I'm not sure exactly what happened on Franklin Street, so I apologize. But if it's the same, right? I mean, Oakland, what they did was both in some commercial corridors, but even more so in neighborhoods, they just closed some streets. Like, let's just let people out. Well, what ends up happening, this is Oakland, which is really sensitive in a good way to try to connect with communities. They ended up hearing from economically disadvantaged communities that they didn't like the closed streets movement, that they actually needed to get in and out to get to their work because they had higher shares of essential workers who were really frontline workers who had to keep showing up for work physically. So you've got this thing that sounded to like the Twitterverse, like let's just call it for what it was, like all the planners are like, this is the best thing I've ever heard. And then the Oakland community, the people it's supposed to benefit were like, yo, like, I don't know if we really like this actually. Like, you're actually inconveniencing our life. Maybe there's a different way you can go about it. All I can report, and it sounds like, Anne, you and I are probably like listeners in a lot of the same, you know what I mean, like national webinars and things, and probably Bergen and Jeffrey, you too. But like, I don't think anyone has figured this out at all right now. And it is really tough times. And what that forces, because planning issues are so inherently local by definition, and so locally sensitive, that the experimentation has to happen and be in each community individually. And there is not a clear forum in my mind, not because anyone's at deficit organizationally, but where do you exchange these best practices? It is not really clear how we do that. And again, which is a good thing, we're living through a moment on top of a public health crisis that we've had, at least we're all roughly the same generation, the best period of awareness of, you know, historic and structural disadvantage based on the color of our skin, right? So like, we're trying to grapple with all that in real time. It's a lot. And I think places are struggling with kind of that first step is recognizing you have a problem. I think we're there, but I think advancing past that like first step has been really tough for a lot of places, certainly to demonstrate what their new definitions of success would be.
So I certainly have no real answers on engagement, but I can at least talk about awareness and things we've been doing to try to make sure that people know what we're doing. So, you know, in addition to our complement of digital stuff, we've taken a lot of work in trying to do physical signs, do moving billboards. You know, luckily we have buses that are able to have outside advertisements on them. So investing money into like putting those on our vehicles in multiple languages. The town has a language access plan that includes obviously English as primary, but Spanish, Korean, Burmese, and Mandarin for our communities here. So working with our housing community and some of our language partner groups to make sure that we can get our core messages translated and putting all of those onto signs and getting those into the community as early as possible. In addition to going through a pandemic, we went through major service changes where we were able to add Sunday service for the first time, but it also meant that for the first time in about 40 years and add frequency on routes and a lot of great things, but it also meant that there were some stops that went out of service, some routes that weren't coming back at a point in time where not everybody is around to really see the impact because we're not running our regular service. A lot of the students who depend on this were not in the community yet. So working with our planning team to figure out what is being impacted, working with our language partners to get all the information assembled and putting that all onto signage and then going out into, you know, the community and putting that information up there with contact information that people could use so that they could get back in touch with us should they see anything. You know, just working on, I guess, equity and awareness is the best thing that we've been able to really do in terms of engagement thus far.
And I guess to follow up on that, Jeffrey, do you, and not just during COVID, but in general, since I know you have experience working in Chapel Hill as well as with Go Triangle and in Durham. So have you noticed any like differences in the ways that you have to engage with the different communities? Because I agree, like as Adie said, you know, each community will have its own needs and its own way that you have to interact with them. And there's no, you know, there's no one path. Have you seen any differences or things that have worked in one place and not in the other?
When it comes to marketing and outreach, I'm a big believer that meeting somebody where they are is the best way to do something. So randomly showing up at a grocery store, being at community festivals, really getting in somebody's face is the best way to remind them that they should care about what it is that I'm working on. And unfortunately, people are in their house or they're at their job, which are not places that are very easily, that's very easy to interact. So don't really have great solutions, but across the board, that's where I found I've gotten a lot of success with really engaging with people, is showing up to where they are, and at places where they're not stressed out about what's happening at work, or where their to-do list is not front of mind, where they are there to try to enjoy some leisure and they can make the choice to listen.
Great. And yeah, these are all definitely very big questions, and we don't all have the answers. So of course, we just have to continue to talk about it. So I guess moving forward, how do y'all see the future of transportation development shifting, as far as what kinds of projects you might see, as well as, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of these centuries old racial injustices that are being brought to the surface, the processes that lead to these new projects, how do you see those changing?
I'll toss out one idea, hopefully fairly quick, that we've been working on for a while. So I apologize to Katie in the intro, I didn't mention this. So this is kind of maybe the most fun project we're working on. And assuming it's a lot of students listening in, something that I push you all to look into is in as much as we're interested in, let's call them broadly, like built environment concerns, whether it's transportation, how the built environment impacts the natural environment, there is a real push I've seen over the last 5+ years in the broadly, certainly transportation circles, let's stay there, to figure out how to better bring in these broader outcomes that we want to achieve, and how does transportation either help advance them or hinder them. And there is so much that we're left with as a legacy in transportation and all infrastructure sectors by kind of design, where these are multi-generational systems we built. You know, the right of way, I say this all the time I speak to groups, like the right of way you find in European and older Asian cities have probably existed for potentially multiple millennia. Like a road of some quality has been in that one place. So think about the length here. And what we're coming off of in the United States is a commitment to not just the automobile, but to taking up a tremendous amount of space per individual or per individual household. And we're just now understanding the just desserts of that. And it is really, really inequitable socially, and it is really devastating for the environment. And we have to figure out as a transportation community how to bring in more of the outcomes we want to achieve, and then make sure our programs act in service of it. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, like, I don't think it's fair to expect a transportation engineer to understand what, like, the best way to design or to even set what social outcomes could be, right? We have other folks who specialize in that. We need to figure out how to get the built environment professionals to effectively be like the second step of a process, right? So it's not about necessarily more people riding transit, which, by the way, I'm a fan of. We need to get a lot more people on transit. It's really good on a whole bunch of levels. But to get more people on transit, we need to make sure that it's motivated by the right reasons, and that we then put in policy infrastructure around it to make it right. And we are far from that, but there's a lot of regions that are starting to do it. We're working with Portland, Oregon, Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas, and the Twin Cities in Minnesota on this concept we call an economic value atlas. But what it really is just one example. There's going to be tons of different ones of this, of how to figure out for metropolitan planning organizations who help both manage federal funds, but really help design like regional strategies for places, their long-term growth trends, as Anne was talking about her work right in the intro. How can we bring in some of those outcomes that are probably set outside the MPO, outside the Department of Transportation, bring them in and say, okay, if this is what we want to achieve, how can we better understand where we're succeeding, where we're failing, and how we can then use our limited transportation dollars to make investments that advance those causes, not causes we're actually not in support of. So this is a huge need all across the country, communities of all sizes. And I'm actually really confident that, frankly, it is younger people out there who are like, they're aware of this, right? Like, what are you trying to achieve? Rather than, frankly, my parents' generation was like, doesn't everyone just want to drive, like, on highways? Isn't that what everyone wants to do? I think that ship sailed, actually, and that's a good thing.
I was just gonna to add on. I think that it's been coming for a while, but like the pandemic has helped to accelerate this. I think we're gonna have to spend a lot of time really justifying our value and the purpose of what we do to people going forward, because right, a lot of people have gotten out of the habit of using transit. A lot of people, I know I got several emails from people who got right comfy with parking on campus, and then they had to take a bus again. They're like, what's happening? So I think in transit and transportation in general, and really in just every aspect of what we do, the world is changing enough that we're going to have to remind people what it is we are doing, what our goals are, and why this is the best way, and have a conversation with people that's not based in we've always done it this way, but we're doing it this way because this is best for these reasons.
The Chapel Hill Planning Department, and I know other departments around town also, but the Planning Department, I know because that's where I am, has really dug into the racial equity conversations. We have bi-weekly meetings with our team and read, all the articles and listen to podcasts and all the things that we can do to educate ourselves and inform ourselves about things that we don't necessarily know. But we're doing this with the intent of seeing what it is about our planning process that we can change and look at things through an equity lens. And I don't think any of us know exactly what that looks like just yet, but we are having those conversations and starting to come up with action items. I think one of them, that immediately comes to mind is how we notify the public of projects that are coming up. It's written in our ordinance currently that we notify property owners and not necessarily residents, so that you rent an apartment or a mobile home or something like that, you're not going to get the notice that maybe where you live is going to be rezoned to something else. So we're starting to work on these sorts of things, but it really takes some reflection and some digging to see how we can do better and what it is that needs to change and how we can change that.
I would say, I guess there's just so much uncertainty in this moment, but I think the one thing that I'm sure about is like the way we've been doing things in terms of community engagement is no longer going to cut it. And I think some of the things that I'm seeing, it's like a couple of years ago or a year ago, the city of Durham launched a project around engagement ambassadors where we started paying people for engagement. And I remember in the area that being such a radical idea, like other people had not done that. And now, as we're like, our elected officials expect to see more representative engagement, our communities expect to see more representative engagement, this idea is becoming normalized, right? Like if you want people's time and you want their input and you want representative engagement, you might have to pay people for engagement, right? So I think we are, some things are becoming standardized, like, that we have to collect data on who we're engaging and how we're engaging them and what works and what doesn't. And maybe not as much, but like that, paying in people for engagement is not the craziest idea. And my only hope is that this is going to translate to better cities, better transportation networks. I think it's going to be a long time coming, but this is the thing that I hope that we get out of this moment, is that we're going to change the way we do things and get serious about doing equitable community engagement, and hopefully that will be reflected in our built environment.
Great, thank you so much, you all, for sharing. So now we're gonna open it up to questions. Are you all able to see the questions, or is it just me? Okay, so the first question is from Natalie, and she said, how have you or your organizations utilized clean tech and clean tech energy in projects or initiatives? How feasible is implementing clean tech, and are there constraints in doing so?
So I'll start off or take it, because I don't know how much clean tech projects everybody else does. We're constantly looking at what are new fuels, what are new technologies we can use that produce a cleaner footprint. Right now, we have the funding, I believe, to buy 6 electric buses, and I think that our first 3 or 4 are on order. which is super exciting. Thank you to Representative Price for his help in Washington on helping us get funding for all of that. So those are on order, and there have been some delays with COVID, but we should be getting those next year, which I think leads me into some of the constraints. It takes a long time for us to get certain things. A bus takes 8 to 12 months to produce, and then they get shipped across the country. So like when we get a new bus, we've been working on getting that bus for 4 or 5 years. The pace and we are planning to use that bus for 12 to 20 years. So the pace with which we can revolve our fleet and switch over, and the cost that it takes to do that, all of that means that we have to be relatively sure that something's going to work. So, we believe that taking steps like this, getting 3 or 4, installing technology to see what we can learn, make sure that we're optimized to make the best use is the best way to go. Start off with a trial, and then once that's successful, continue to build on that. But I mean, it takes time, which is unfortunate. We can't roll over it and turn our fleet electric or some kind of biofuel next month, like not even next year. It's a process of at least a decade that it takes to begin to revolve that. But all of it starts with taking first steps, like getting electric vehicles or testing out new fuels or that kind of stuff. In addition to that, and to getting new things, we also have to think about the infrastructure that we need for that. So if we get electric vehicles, we need places to charge them. So we have to work with our power company to make sure that they can deliver the stuff we need. We need to work with permitting and engineers to make sure that we're building the infrastructure for our electric vehicles or whatever else we may need into the process. So let's just say we are excited to be getting an electric bus in a year or so, but we also know that we have to get real busy because there's a lot of pieces that go into adopting new technology and a lot of startup costs that we have to also implement along with that stuff.
Great, and our next question is, how can we balance the, one, the desire to participate in public transit for social and environmental reasons, with 2, the knowledge that each new person presents more risk, and because of COVID restrictions, you may be taking the seat from someone who needs the limited seats for their job?
So I think it's all a question of intentionality, and it's a question of setting yourself up for success. On a normal day, right, you could just come out on the street and hop on the first bus and squeeze in. Now, I think there's just a lot more planning that needs to go into that. You need to be getting to the stop as early as you possibly can and have a plan for if you are able to get on the first bus that passes by, or if you're going to have to get on the second or third bus that comes by. So like, if you get on that first bus, what can you go to a place on campus or to in your community where you can do what you need to do? Unfortunately, normally transit can be, especially in our community, close to what it would take you to drive to a place. Now it might be that you have to have, like, you might be investing a lot of time in it. So you need to do it on a day where you have the time to invest. There's no sense in you getting fatigued and having a terrible experience and ruining transit in your mind simply because it wasn't the right day to take transit. I wanted to say something else about taking the seat away from somebody else, but I don't really remember what I was going to say. Say that our job is to make sure that everybody who shows up at the stop gets to where they need to go, and we're going to make that happen. It's just a matter of, can we be patient during that process and can each person give themselves enough time to do what they need to do? And on the safety side of it, I'm a big believer that every person is responsible for doing whatever they can do to make themselves safe. And some of these days, I would hope that most people who are getting on buses understand why to wear a mask, or why you shouldn't be sitting right next to each other. Unfortunately, some people don't, and I don't want to go around and encouraging people to confront people, but I think you just have to know what your own personal willingness to risk is, how to best protect yourself, and how to best make your environment to work. So anybody getting on a bus, I recommend, you wear your mask, you open the windows around you, you sit where the agency tells you is good to sit. And if somebody makes you uncomfortable, you position yourself so that you're as far from that person as possible.
Cool. Are there any other questions? I know that Greg has one. Do you want to turn on your mic, or do you want me to read it?
You can read it.
Okay. Yeah, well, so with regards to opportunities for transportation, there is we think there's a pretty high possibility that Joe Biden is going to be elected. And so are there opportunities that y'all are planning for with regards to possible stimulus money in funding large transit projects?
I think it could be transit, or it could also be non-traditional, like biking and walking infrastructure. But seems like communities need to be ready with shovel-ready plans. If the last stimulus is any lesson, that the money will go to shovel-ready projects.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Greg. I'll try to be quick, especially as a Bergen man can jump into, and Jeffrey. If Biden wins, which is far from over, so folks want to see that, especially in North Carolina, you should get out and knock on some doors as safely as possible. There's a very real chance that we're going to have a sizable stimulus come January. I find it really difficult to imagine, no matter what happens with the Senate hold, which for folks who know right now, right, the Senate is up for, there's potential that it could turn over, especially if there's a Biden win. It only needs to flip to 50 seats. Then the Democrats have control. That would give them control of all chambers. The House is not really up this year, based on almost all modeling, actually all modeling. The potential for a built environment stimulus is really high. There's not universal support. The angle you're going to want to be watching is the Biden team is really leading their infrastructure policies publicly. There's some different stuff happening privately, but they really are anchoring it around their clean plan, which is part of their Build Back Better agenda. That absolutely includes massive investments in mass transit, both rail and bus, especially BRT. So there's very real potential that could happen. There's also the major federal surface transportation plan, which, right, all four of us touch in different ways. That expires here at the end of September, so they will not pass a reauthorization of that this year. That's not happening, like, for sure, privately. But they will have to, they can only kick the can, as it were, down so far. So chances are that ropes into a stimulus, to your question, Greg. So it's kind of roped into, you don't just want to throw money at this one time. Ideally, you kind of figure out how to operationalize policy at the same time. There's a lot of very hungry Democrats that have been designing policy solutions in the DC wilderness for 4 years now. So they would love to get their hands on things. But built into your question, and part of my personal answer then too, that was all honestly like fact I just dropped. The challenge here is on bike ped, and it sounds like Bergen in particular could probably weigh on a lot of this, maybe you too, Anne, from the prior hat. The feds always have a really tough time determining how they should invest in bike ped. The Dems always want to, but bike ped is so inherently local, even if it shouldn't be, that the feds prioritize intercity or intercounty and especially interstate movements. It's really constitutional for them. So keep your eyes on this, because the Dems that are going to run the transition and most likely to be selected for secretaryships, again, if Biden wins, would love to invest more in bike ped. They'll have to figure out what's the best avenue to do that. I think there's a real chance for it. The challenge here, what I think you're going to see really fascinating come up in the next 2+ years, really potentially for a whole decade, is the Democrats are finally starting to understand, and I think the Republicans are too, actually, including the Trump administration, give them credit, that effective transportation outcomes is completely driven by real estate, meaning housing, and commercial and industrial policy, like real estate policy. So basically, right, you're going to get a lot of people taking transit if you have density like New York. Now, most places aren't going to look like New York, but they look so different than it that it's really hard, no matter how much you throw transit dollars at the problem. We saw this in Dallas over about 3 decades, is that they have very low transit ridership, even though they have still the longest light rail system in the country. And that's because they're so strong. So what I think the Dems really want to figure out, and a lot of insiders are talking about this, is how do you square the need for affordable housing, including in the Research Triangle, right? But especially, right, Boston, Seattle, et cetera. How do you figure that out? How do we figure out where we're incentivizing jobs to be built, whether they're kind of commercial service, including tradable services, lower skill services, as well as kind of manufacturing and things? How do we figure out how to solve the real estate crises and put them together with infrastructure policy? It's a really hard challenge, but it's clearly the one that this generation is going to have to fix. So I think it's going to be so a very long answer, but I think that's going to be part of the agenda. And if they can find a unified solution to that, that's when you get really big money. But the big money for transport actually might look, in some cases, like big money for real estate considerations that end up creating positive feedback loops for infrastructure investment.
Great. Would anyone else like to add on to that? Well, I know that we've gone a little bit over time, so thank you all for sticking with us. But yeah, we really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you to the panelists for
follow up to the local, especially to Anne Phillips. If such stimulus money were to come on the table, the light rail project was almost shovel ready, but Duke didn't want the vibrations. But there are now electric buses that charge every stop, being developed by several companies. Would there be a look in the triangle to kind of revive that project, but in a way that could at least get around some of the opposition from Duke University by using buses that don't have the vibration issue instead of light rail? And it would cost a fraction of what the light rail project was going to cost.
I would say, so there are a lot of other issues, I think, with the light rail project, with funding and the state and the North Carolina Railroad. So like, that's not the only issue. I will say, if there is stimulus, we do have the transit tax in Durham. I think, which a lot of folks were really, well, we were still excited to have the transit tax even after the light rail sort of went away. Because we were like, oh, we can do all of these other projects, you know, like we can look at BRT. Chapel Hill is looking at BRT right now. And then the sales tax tanked during COVID, right? So I think that, again, we're working on the transit plan, so it's too early to say. And one of the reasons there's urgency to get the transit plans updated is because we have to put something in place of the light rail. And we have to figure out what to do with the money that we do have. So once those plans are in place, I think I would be on better ground to answer, you know, what would we do with stimulus? And I think Bergen could probably speak about what's going on in Orange County and Chapel Hill in particular, given that they're looking at the BRT route. But personally, I'm team BRT. BRT is great, and electric BRT is even better. So.
Yeah, I think Chapel Hill has a BRT project that is getting towards shovel ready. I think we're at about 30% engineering, and that's moving pretty quickly now. And we are working with Durham and looking at some regional options that would take the place of the light rail. I don't know that you can translate a shovel-ready light rail project directly into a shovel-ready BRT project, just considering the route and the needs of rail versus bus. But I think that we are fairly well positioned to work off of those efforts. And if any money can come this way to help us with that, then I think we'll be ready to use it.
Great, thank you so much. Did you have anything to, oh, no one had anything to add, okay. Yeah, so I see that there's one more question, but if any of the panelists have to leave, that's totally fine. Otherwise, you're welcome to stick around and answer it. So this one is from Mark. Rural transit seems like a unique challenge, specifically because of what you're mentioning here. Oh yeah, with regards to the sprawl and the difficulty with getting public transit for dense areas. So yeah, do you know of any potential ways to address the rural challenge here with transit?
I think a big portion of that is kind of what Adie alluded to. It's like, how do you mesh transportation needs with infrastructure and with real estate and with jobs? Because right, mass transit doesn't work if there's not mass. So you want a lot of people going to the same place from the same place. And until that happens, there are probably things we could do if we started planning out circulators really well and local commissions really like work together. But outside of that, I feel like it's demand response on an as needed basis is probably the best you're going to get until you can really have like communities set up to have people funnel into one place and all go to the same place if we're doing transit the way it looks now. Now, if there's some new form of transit that we don't know about yet, I can't really answer that.
Yeah,
I would just, oh, go ahead, Anne. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, this is sort of one of the big things we're trying to resolve in the upcoming Durham Transit Plan. There's a lot of demand, or there's a lot of interest in transit out in Durham County, which is a lot more rural. And we have to balance that with the desire for transit within the city limits in the city center that's a lot more dense. And I really think this is where engagement is going to come into play, right? Like, so how do we create a system that both serves, you know, our rural county and in the city where there's a lot of demand, right? Because these are both equity issues in different ways. So I'm hoping that if you talk to me in a year, I will I will know more. And so I keep saying that, I'm sorry. I keep like, when the plan is done, we'll figure all these things out. So
yeah, I would just quickly add, it'd be like, it's like folks in like dense cities anywhere in the world being like, I'd really like a lot more outdoor space, right? It's like, well, you don't, like, not everyone can have everything, right? And I know some people don't choose to live in rural areas per se, right? I'm saying like younger people are just born there, but it's, you know, there are some advantages, there are disadvantages. I think Jeffrey spoke really well from especially a common transportation problem. It tends to be really low density. People are going to different places. That's not a good environment for transit. I think what's nice relative to our predecessors is we live in an incredible digital technology era. And the potential for different interventions is high, but as Anne just said, how do we figure out how to deliver that equitably? And I think I'm not trying to just defend transit agencies, that's not just, traditional transit is not here to solve that problem. That's a math problem, that geometry problem that doesn't work for them. So we need to think of different interventions and stop kind of blaming, I don't think this is what the questioner is saying, but like stop blaming transit agencies for what they can't do. Say, well, we have this really cool intervention that works really well in specific corridors. Let's think about a different intervention for different kinds of places. You know, we're in such a dynamic economic epoch for humanity, which is awesome, but that means we need to be more dynamic in our thinking. We can't be like, there's only X solution sets, right? It's got to be more than just what we've had on the books in the past.
Great, yeah, I think you all finished that off really well. I had also been wondering about that too, and I think it'll definitely become more relevant as we continue to advance technologically as well. So, yeah, but yeah, thanks again so much for everyone sitting in on this panel, and thank you to the panelists for participating. This has been a really interesting afternoon, and we'll also be posting this online on the Institute for the Environment website if any of your friends couldn't make it, or if you just want to come back to it again. So thank you so much.
thank you, everyone. That was a great conversation. Thanks.